Hi, Sam.
Hi, Hannah.
What are we talking about today?
We are talking about another movie that we saw last night,
Yes,
and that movie is,
Wicked Part 2 for good.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know already coming out of this that people are probably going to hear what I have to say and think, wow, he kind of didn't like that movie. But I want to just start up at the beginning and say, I liked the movie. It is definitely a very rewatchable movie. The songs are great. I do think that the songs in the first one were maybe more spectacular, but I think this movie is more about the relationship between the two main characters and therefore is a little more insulated.
I don't know how anybody can watch the movie that has no good deed in it and say that the songs weren't spectacular. I found that spectacular. You might listen to this and think, wow, she really likes this movie so much that she can't be very critical of it at all. And you would be correct about that. I love to be dazzled by musical theater.
Yeah. But let's start with a
Speed summary.
Okay, you have a minute and a half, Hannah.
Okay, now before we go into the summary, I just want to say that this is the second half of an adaptation of a book that is a variant plot for a pre-existing novel and movie. So if you don't know the rough plot of The Wizard of Oz or Wicked Part 1, you'll be a little confused, I think. I'm not going to try to give all of that context. So we're going to try to do a speed summary. I'm going to get a minute and a half to go through as much of the plot as I possibly can. And then Sam is going to get a minute and a half to finish it. We're doing this because in the past, when we've done movies, pretty much the whole episode has just been us summarizing the plot, which can be fine, but we're trying something different.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready? Boom. Okay. We open exactly where we picked up at the end of the last movie. Elphaba is hidden away, isolated from everybody, and being presented as evil, murderous, and the enemy of the people. Meanwhile, Glinda has become a public figure. There's a lot of propaganda posters about each of them. Glinda as Glinda the Good, this beautiful, morally pure character, and Elphaba as an evil witch who has to be taken down. Elphaba does some direct action civil disobedience. She disrupts a work camp, it looks like, where the animals are being abusively made to construct the yellow brick road, and she is chased away on her broomstick. And then we go to Glinda, where she's talking to her PR team, and she's getting a lot of awards. And then it's established that she is now engaged to Fiyero, who seems lukewarm about the whole situation, even though she is still very much in love with him. They do the grand opening of the Yellow Brick Road, which Elphaba interrupts by writing in the sky, "Our wizard lies." Oh my god.
Yeah, as soon as you were like 10 seconds in, I was like, I got a lot I'm gonna have to lift right
Okay, I think we need to rethink this approach.
No, I mean, we have set the standards pre-podcast and we're going to uphold our values. Are you ready for me to do the last 2 hours of Wicked Part 2 in a minute and a half?
Wait, no, I think we ought to rethink this approach.
Well, let me try, and then we can go back and fill in.
All right, ready? Go.
All right, Our Wizard Lies. Madame Morrible turns that into Oz Dies so that she can manufacture the plot that everyone hates Elphaba. Then we cut to Bach and Nessa, and they're spatting. Nessa is still in love with Bach. Bach, obviously, or you can tell, does not love her. Then we cut back to Elphaba in her place. She's discouraged. She's trying to figure out how she can change people's minds. Then we go back to Glinda, and Glinda's doing stuff. And then there's the marriage. So Elphaba comes in and interrupts the marriage. You think for a second that Glinda, Elphaba, and the wizard have reconciled, but no, the wizard's bad. Elphaba releases the animals, ruins the wedding. Glinda's mad. Madame Morrible drops a house on Nessa. Elphaba's mad. Elphaba and Glinda's fight. Dorothy takes the shoes. Elphaba and Fiyero fall in love. And they have sex, and Elphaba goes full hardcore metal. Wow.
This this wasn't the best idea. We should have gone with like 3 minutes apiece.
I think even then it would have been difficult.
I know. This is like there's a lot that happens in this movie.
Yeah, but I think too that I'm going to assume, especially as you put the caveat up front, that if you're listening to this to try and get the full blow-by-blow details of this movie, this is not the podcast for you.
Some important plot takeaways are that Fiyero, in fact, is in love with Elphaba,
Yes.
not Glinda. Nessa had taken over as governor of Munchkinland, and because she is so motivated only by her love for and need to control Bach, that she capitulates to the civil rights violations of animals and munchkins. That ends in tragedy for Bach. He gets turned into the Tin Man. Elphaba meets again with the lion cub who she thought that she rescued in part 1. Turns out he feels that she ruined his life. And after Glinda sends Dorothy away with the slippers that belonged to Nessa, there is a confrontation where Fiyero threatens Glinda's life in order to save Elphaba. And because of that, Fiyero is taken away and beaten. He would have been beaten to death, except that Elphaba does some kind of spell on him to try to save him. That turns him into a scarecrow. Now we have the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, and the Scarecrow. Those are the 3 characters who Dorothy meets. And the ending is that Elphaba, big spoiler, fakes her own death. Everyone believes that Elphaba is dead, including Glinda. And Glinda ends up sending the wizard away, overpowering Madame Morrible, and becoming, hopefully, a more benevolent ruler.
And then Elphaba, surprise, surprise, is not dead. The Scarecrow, i.e. Fiyero, and she go off into the land beyond Oz and live happily ever after.
Yes. Glinda has a much more challenging ending than Elphaba does, which I guess makes sense because her life up till this point has been not challenging at all.
Whereas Elphaba's has.
Yes. What's your personal relationship to Wicked?
It was the first Broadway show I saw. We were kind of far back in the show. It didn't leave me with a great impression. I also haven't been...
Wicked as a whole didn't leave you with a great
Well, just the show, the Broadway show.
didn't. Oh.
Because I think if I had been closer, I would have been more into it, like literally in the spectacle of it. And I think I was so far away that it was like I was staring at a bunch of people in front of me who were watching the show rather than like being enveloped into the show. And I think that's just a product of living in a society where the show Wicked is so popular that they're going to sell out every show.
Yeah.
And the thing about Wicked that really resonates with me probably is taking a story that we all know well and telling it from a different perspective that shows, while hitting all the same plot beats as The Wizard of Oz, it shows how maybe what we were shown in the original movie was an inaccurate portrayal of the characters in it. And I think that really is something that change of perspective is something, again, that the movie talks about a lot and I find very important in everyday life and our analysis and understanding of the things that go on around us.
That history is told by the winners and that any story can be inverted to force you to sympathize with a completely different figure.
Yeah. And I think this particular revisionist story is interesting. This is something that they do a lot in comic books. Like they turn the anti-hero into a good guy. But in that sense, what they often do is they change the story. In this adaptation, all of the major plot beats still happen. And instead, what we see is how decisions came to be made that resulted in the same outcomes, but we gain a better perspective on the characters who we didn't understand as well.
Which complicates the idea of good versus evil.
Yes.
And why is that important to you?
Because I think that good versus evil, that very black and white thinking, was a very prominent understanding of the world that I grew up in.
How so? Is it a Christian worldview?
It's a Christian worldview. It's a conservative worldview. It's a simplified way of viewing the world. I could give tons of examples that I think would probably fit better than me trying to underlay the ideology, but it's the cops and the robbers. It's the heroes of light versus the forces of darkness. It's
the good boys and bad boys.
Yeah. And while I definitely had a lot of stories growing up that engaged with the nuance.
Dark Knight comes to mind.
Yeah. But even in that one, there's this portrayal of everything that Batman does. Even though he is a dark, brooding character, he's still kind of like the force of good, and the Joker's very much the chaotic evilness. One of my favorite characters in the movies is Two-Face because of his struggle with the nuance of things and the struggle to be good in a society that kind of forces him to make tough decisions. We'll save that for the Dark Knight episode.
Okay.
What is it about Wicked that resonated with you?
The first movie, the first half of the play, deals a lot with stigma and spoiled identity and how that affects somebody's self-conception and relationships. And I really relate to that because of my experience being disabled. You see the difference between stigmatized identity and spoiled identity in the difference between how Nessa and Elphaba are treated. That's an important distinction. I identify a little bit with each of them. And it speaks a lot to the power of close female friendships, the whole story overall. And that's been a huge part of my life from a pretty early age.
I just want to say, it would have been very easy to make Glinda the dopey blonde stereotype. And I think by fleshing out her character more and putting them more on equal footing, that it avoided that trope, but also it gave much more weight to their friendship in that way.
Yeah, I wouldn't either accuse the musical of flattening her in that way, but I do think that they fleshed her out beautifully. I feel like Wicked Part 1 belonged to Elphaba and Wicked Part 2 belonged to Glinda. And Ariana Grande did a beautiful job with that character. And I couldn't help thinking of Ariana Grande when she was singing We Couldn't Be Happier. Happy is what happens when all your dreams come true. That kind of predictable grief that starlets go through, being held up as this flawless, fragile, beautiful ideal, and then almost without exception, torn down when they fail to live up to the standards of that pedestal for generations. That is something that our society loves to do with women, young, talented women in particular. And I think that it's happened pretty brutally to Ariana Grande. I'm not trying to say like she's a perfect angel who's never done anything wrong. I'm just trying to say like she's lived through a great deal of trauma and she is often not well. And she is also like a once in a generation talent vocally and as an actor and comedian.
Yeah, I forget the exact song by Taylor Swift, but like if I were a man, you wouldn't be scrutinizing me to the extent that you are.
No, and I always like feel weird saying that about starlets because it's inevitably received as me saying that they do no harm and that their privilege is not meaningful. And it's not to say that just to acknowledge a double standard, you know what I mean? And also to acknowledge that when there's been a terrorist attack at one of your shows, when an ex and a close friend has lost his life to suicide, and when you have clearly dealt with some major health issues that I don't and can't know the details of, that's got to be difficult, especially when the whole world holds you up as someone with a perfect life. That's a big part of Glinda's character, and maybe that's why we get so much of what people perceive as like over-the-top sappiness with Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo. Yeah, I think Wicked is girlhood. That's why Wicked is important to me.
Yeah, and to that point, Ariana Grande, her facial expressions were great. That they carried a lot of weight in times that she wasn't speaking.
I was particularly impressed with Girl in the Bubble, but actually I just absolutely adored both of the original songs in this movie. Girl in the Bubble, I thought, fleshed out Glinda's arc and gave us real reason to have faith that as the new ruler, she was actually going to try to fight injustice and restore civil liberties to the animals, which I don't think that we really knew that from the stage show. And also it was clearly written for an R&B singer who is also trained as a coloratura soprano. We heard that gorgeous, breathy R&B singing that is her signature. And then we also heard plenty of the beautiful, floaty, light coloratura soprano stuff that we associate with Glinda. It was a great way to embrace the vocalist that they actually had. And then No Place Like Home was a beautiful recasting of a phrase from the source material. One of the pieces of the original source material, The Wizard of Oz, which is something that it's really fun when Wicked does that. And also a beautiful encapsulation of the patriotism of protest, which is incredibly relevant right now and obviously resonates a great deal with the struggle for immigration rights. That this country belongs to immigrants, that immigrants are the best thing about this country. And so we must assert to welcome immigrants and to make sure that immigrants have the opportunity to build a life here is to be a patriotic American.
Mm-hmm.
And we are so far from that. So those were some things that were really emotionally resonant for me about Wicked. And I want to give like a quick explanation of how this movie can be read as an allegory for fascism and scapegoating, moral panics, and the glamour and glitz and spectacle of fascism. Fascism is a political movement that tends to come out of a functioning democracy. There is typically populism, right? So a lot of rhetoric about everyday concerns, being able to make your living and support your family, and intense nationalism. Nationalism meaning ethnic superiority and a strong invocation of our connection with this land and the superiority of that connection. There tends to be a charismatic leader. There tends to be an appeal to a return to traditional values, which tends to include strict gender hierarchy and racial hierarchies. There's always like an idea of this great, glorious, shining, beautiful future that we would be able to reach if we could only get rid of the unwanted people in our society. So those would be the scapegoats. In Nazi Germany, it was Jewish people, Romani people, queer people, disabled people. And now I think what we're seeing is that the scapegoats are trans people, Latinos, immigrants, Arabs. So in the world of Wicked, the charismatic fascist leader is the wizard. Fascist leaders' inability to actually enact social policy that would uplift the working class is represented by the wizard's inability to actually do any magic, that it's all smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of spectacle when it comes to fascism. We associate Nazi Germany with those huge, grand military parades. And in The Wizard of Oz, that's portrayed as like that big, scary talking head that's actually controlled by a series of levers and pulleys. The smoke machines, the sparkling, twinkling lights, huge architectural projects that are powered by slave labor. And the scapegoats in Wicked are the animals. We see their freedom of movement being controlled. They can't travel through the land without a permit. We see them being caged. We see their history being erased, right? Like in the first movie, there's a big picture of a scholar who was an animal at the university, and we see that it's been covered up with a big stylized poster of the wizard. Those are some of the ways that Wicked portrays fascism in the world of Oz. And then we have these two main characters that encapsulate different theories of change. I don't want to say that, like, this is a movie about politics. Like, clearly it's a story about relationships, too. But in Elphaba, we have moral rigidity, reactivity, inflexibility to compromise. We see Glinda make the case in many different ways to Elphaba. When you fly off the handle, when you have these huge emotional reactions, what you're doing is not actually helping anybody.
And you're feeding the opposition to paint you as a crazy person.
In Glinda, we see a more incrementalist, feel-good model of change. So I'm going to work within the system. I'm going to reassure people and give them something to believe in and feel happy and safe about. I would say that Glinda doesn't even develop that as a theory of change until the end of Wicked Part 2, which is weird because you see her starting to formulate it in the first movie. But I think that she wants to believe in the good intentions of the leaders that she's working under. And so she closes her eyes to a lot of human rights abuses or animal rights abuses that are clearly representative of human rights abuses. That's my political theory of Wicked Part 2 for good.
And I think, as you said, while the movie certainly is a product of 2025, it is not meant to be a solution or an answer to our current political situation.
This iteration is a project of 2025, but these types of stories have been told a lot longer than that. Yeah.
So I do want to get into some of the cynicism in the film that I expressed to you, and then you kind of gave a word to it. But before I do that, I do want to say how powerful that relationship is between the two of them. Like, by the end, did you cry in this movie?
Probably. I feel like I did. I feel like
I mean, you definitely cried in the first one.
I cried for the entirety of the first one, but partially it was just I was crying from the fact that I was watching a good film adaptation of Wicked.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in this one, the emotional climax of the film, by the time Elphaba closes the door between her and Glinda in the tower to hide Glinda away, in both song and voice and facial expressions, you can just really feel the pain. And even just in the words, like, there's something so powerful to me, powerfully like emotional in the words, "We may never see each other again."
Oh yeah, it well may be that we will never meet again in this lifetime.
Yeah. Knowing that your best friend and lover, that you have to say goodbye to them.
Do you think that the romantic dynamic between those two characters is part of either movie?
What do you mean?
If you were taking the movies on their own, outside of the context of the book, would you read a romantic relationship between those two characters? Maybe that's
Yeah.
impossible to... Yeah, you would?
In a way, the fact that Elphaba ends up with Fiyero in the end almost seems like she got the second best. She couldn't have Glinda, but at least she got Fiyero as a happy ending, to me, because...
Maybe the three of them just really ought to have been a polyamorous triad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because I think Fiyero certainly cares for and has a deep affection for Glinda. And she even recognizes it when he points the gun. I mean, he clearly...
Oh yeah, when he points the gun at her and she said he was never going to harm me.
Yeah, and she knows that, and he knows that, and he...
I still read that moment as a pretty intense betrayal, though.
Oh yeah, for sure, because he was pushed to the point of, in his own black and white thinking, it's either Elphaba or Glinda, and who am I really going to want to save? He's put into a situation where he feels the only way he can save Elphaba is by threatening Glinda's life.
And he knows that Glinda is not in danger.
Yeah, because he knows that deep down he couldn't harm her, and she knows that too.
Also, like, Elphaba is in danger from the guards, and Glinda is in no danger from the world that she lives in.
Yeah, but I do agree, yes, it definitely is a shock to Glinda, and it definitely is him being forced to kind of decide. That is the ultimate, like, decision point, is whose life am I willing to risk? But I don't think he romantically loves
Glinda. Maybe he identifies with her struggle, being a child of privilege and having the expectation to put upon him to project perfection all the time and to inspire and delight everyone around him to never turn off the charisma. I think maybe that's something that they share, but Glinda never really gets vulnerable with him about it. She doesn't allow that connection to take root.
To go back, if we aren't reading them as a polyamorous triad, I mean, obviously the emotional resonance between Glinda and Elphaba is just so much more visceral. You know, and even in the very final moments of the movie, I think the very last shot is Glinda whispering something into Elphaba's ear.
Yeah, which was a little callback to the famous Broadway poster.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. But I also think it encapsulates the fact that Glinda and Elphaba are really the true couple of the movie, but they can't be together.
Yeah.
And so that song, For Good, really weighs so much more because the fact that they aren't going to get to be together.
It also shows how, in a certain sense, they do get to be together because they have now become a part of each other permanently. The language of that song is mostly about, you've changed me forever. I am altered. There is part of you living on in me forever now. What that change is for each of them is that Glinda pulls the gauze from over her eyes. She takes off her rose-colored glasses. She pops the shiny pink bubble and sees the injustice and cruelty in the world around her and realizes that she needs to tell the truth. She's going to hold on to her inclination to be kind, to be gentle, and to make people feel comforted and safe, but not at the expense of honesty. That's the change that we see in her at the very end when she's addressing the Munchkins, when she calls all of the animals out and when she says, you know, I have real limitations and I am only going to do my best to help you, which is not something that you would have heard her say at the beginning. And then the way that Glinda changes Elphaba is realizing that by acting purely on her own principles and speaking only the harshest truth, that you can't actually affect change that way. That you have to also meet people where they're at. You have to also be strategic and practice self-restraint. And there are multiple ways to look at the same situation. You hear her say, when Fiyero first calls her beautiful, she says, "You don't have to lie to me." She thinks the world treats me as ugly, and therefore it is objectively true that I am ugly. And through her relationship with Glinda and her relationship with Fiyero, she realizes that you can look at the same thing through a different pair of eyes and see beauty in it, in herself and in Fiyero once he's been changed. That ability that Glinda has is part of what will allow her to be a change maker in the long run, which is lovely. And also, I think many could rightfully argue, is a political message that does not meet the needs of the current political moment. I don't know that I would argue that, but I think it's a valid argument.
One more thing I want to talk about the movie. This is probably where I'm going to come across as very critical. I couldn't help but thinking, even in that last song between the two of them, how if you consider what is happening from a broader viewpoint, in the end, the Wicked Witch, her effigy is getting burned. Everything that is good about Elphaba and everything that Elphaba fought for is being carried on through Glinda, but through kind of like a lie that Elphaba was the bad guy. And the wizard gets to go away unscathed.
I think he's quite tortured.
In the minds of the public. I'm now talking about,
sorry.
and this is where you brought up how the film is kind of cynical.
Perhaps due to the limitations of its source material, treats the collective of Ozians as misguided, stupid, harsh. And I said, I don't think that that's because of the limitations of the source material. I think that that is how this story feels about the masses, that they can be easily misled. And even that masses of people can't, at least immediately, handle unvarnished truth, that they need to be spoon-fed and manipulated.
I wouldn't necessarily call it a critique of the film. The film is much more powerful by being about the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda, but if you were to try to draw a political analogy to it, to a T, I wouldn't agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't agree that we should do what is best in order to, in cynical ways, say manipulate, but I'm sure some other people would call it to guide the perceptions of the public.
You know, this conversation is making me think of Zoran Mamdani and like conversations that I've had with my coworkers about his charm, his winning smile, his warmth, and his charisma. I do think that part of the reason, at least, why it's so very compelling, because it is rooted in authenticity. This is a real New Yorker who is truly embedded in grassroots labor movements. And I think he has the best interests of the city that he lives in his heart. And that was why he won the election.
Yeah.
And a coworker of mine, when we were chatting about this, said, yeah, but I mean, do you think that all of that would really work if he weren't also, 34 and very handsome? And a man? I was like, I think all of that really helps, yeah. But I also think that a gifted political leader can tell you something that you don't like in a way that is not condescending, but empathetic and charming, and perhaps uses a little bit of dazzle to guide you in the right direction.
Yeah, no matter how good someone's morals and principles are. And I think this is where a lot of people get frustrated about politics, is that you can't really be a politician without being charismatic.
No, yeah.
You can be the most principled, the most valued, the most humble person, but if you can't win people over, that's kind of, for better and for worse, is part of the requirements of being a public leader.
Which is terribly ironic, don't you think, when you apply what you just said to conservative frustration and conservative cynicism with politics, because I think a lot of people who contribute to the public good but aren't great public speakers or public figures end up serving as bureaucrats and toiling for an entire career in like a not very high paying public service job. Wouldn't you know, that's the go-to scapegoat of most right-wing populist movements. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. That's not super duper related to Wicked, but
Well, no, I mean, I think in thinking about how the movie ends, I also think about, like, it's hard not to think about what our next steps are as a populace moving forward.
because we can't just get the right charismatic leader in charge and get the unjustly imprisoned people out of cages and back participating fully into society immediately. And I think that not the ending of the movie I felt was a little Disneyfied, but parts of the movie show how fascism affects people's psychology, attempt to show that. So we see the animals lose any sense of faith in their own homeland. They lose their patriotism. They are ready to leave. We see the other animals who have been caged as political prisoners literally lose their ability to speak. And we see Elphaba lose not just the motivation to try to help others, but we also see her question whether she was ever motivated to help others in the first place. Remember when they get into the flashbacks during No Good Deed and she says, was I really seeking good or just seeking attention or something like that? And they show the moment in part 1 where she levitated Nessa against Nessa's wishes. The moment where I don't know that they showed this in the flashback, but it was another moment where her reactivity got the best of her. She sends everyone in class to sleep, kidnaps the lion cub, and goes to set him free. And she questions, were my motives there actually pure?
Mhm.
Was I trying to help others? Or did I just want to create a huge splash? Is all of this downfall my own fault? I think it's a good take on the toll that all of that scapegoating has on a marginalized person. No matter what good I try to do, I'll always be seen as evil.
Yeah.
How long can you keep on being a perfect victim under those circumstances? You can't. And then as soon as you do slip up, that's more fodder for the outrage machine.
Yeah.
But it's very colorful and the songs are great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your favorite song?
Oh, obviously No Good Deed.
Okay.
No question.
I think mine was, despite my whole rant against the fakeness of, obviously, and the spectacle of fascism, I still really liked Wonderful.
Well, it was very compelling.
Yeah, it was very compelling. And I don't know, is there something maybe that we want to talk about, I know, I'm not trying to go all poor white guy here, but what happens to the wizard throughout this movie? It seems that the real villain of the movie is Madame Morrible.
Oh, huh.
I think the wizard is the puppet that Madame Morrible uses to try and maintain her own power. In the end, he learns that and believes that he has killed his daughter and is basically forced to live with the consequences of his actions. Because even in Wonderful, it seems like there is a real desire for the wizard to try and reconcile with Elphaba.
I don't think so. There's a real desire for him to use Elphaba.
Yeah, but I was waiting for the moment where the monkeys were going to get released and they were going to capture Elphaba, or he was going to somehow manipulate the monkeys getting released to show how Elphaba was doing all this bad all along.
He promises her that he's gonna free the animals, and then she immediately finds a secret prison.
Right. And he doesn't appear in the background saying, you foiled my master plan. He comes saying, oh God, I can explain. And he
but
truly...
that's what every villain would say. You can scratch the surface enough times to find some kind of moral self-justification for any villain.
But I think if that were Madame Morrible, she would have said, you foiled my master plan.
I don't think she would have. I think she would have
did.
kept on appealing, like she did with Glinda. She kept on appealing to Glinda.
Well, once she knew that she had lost all the power.
Yeah, which is exactly what the wizard did with Elphaba.
I see the wizard as the puppet. Not that we should feel sorry for him for that. He gets off light, relatively, in the sense that he gets to fly away back home, having learned his lesson, quote unquote.
I don't know, man. I think that he is as evil as Madame Morrible, and I also, I felt that his comeuppance was rather bleak at the end of the movie. Finding out that you've murdered your daughter, and then being banished
Yeah.
from your chosen home. Yeah, I don't know that we're
Yeah, that
gonna
we'll
agree
see eye
about
to
the
eye on
wizard.
that. But yeah,
Because like he is manipulated by Madame Morrible, but I definitely read Wonderful as him manipulating both of those women pretty
yeah,
viciously.
by nature, that is his trade. He is someone who manipulates the perception in order to create a spectacle. And I think that's where I'm coming from, in that he thinks he can, yes, manipulate these two women, but in order to try and create a greater spectacle that he kind of deep down believes will be good.
But I don't care if you deep down believe it will be good if you snatch people off the streets without due process and imprison them. You're bad, you know?
Yeah. I'm not trying to say, oh, maybe he was good all. I think there was a nuanced difference between him and Madame Morrible.
I don't think so.
Okay.
There was a qualitative difference between their personalities, but I don't think that there was a difference in terms of each of their moral character. I think they were both dirty, rotten fascists.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think we should feel sorry for either of them.
No, and I think that the calculatingness of Madame Morrible, I think that that is the role that in fascist movements marginalized people have to take on, right? The fact that she was a woman meant that she would not be able to be perceived as the powerful, strong leader. And the fact that he was a man and that he's using all of this spectacle and misdirection and projection of strength and power with like the sheer size of the figurehead that he created and the flames and the long, dark, scary hallway. Like, I think all of that speaks to the spectacle of masculinity that is inherent in fascism and like the glamorization of military might. Is there anything else that we wanted to talk about? I'm sorry I disagreed with you about the wizard.
You don't have to feel sorry for that. I think I also disagreed with you about the wizard.
Oh yeah,
so
that's true. It's a good
I think I think we can let our viewers decide who is really right.
Yeah. So
Final thoughts.
how can we use what we learned from Wicked Part 2, for good, to act in a more loving way in our society? The first thing that comes to my mind is that anti-fascist activism necessitates a diversity of tactics. That you need confrontational, disruptive direct action, and that you need great storytelling, charisma, warmth, welcoming people into the movement, getting their basic needs met, and that you also need to work within pre-existing political systems, get really good candidates into office, and reform how politics is done at the most local and the highest level. That you need your Elphabas and you need your Galindas, and that they need to learn from each other.
And they can both be flawed people.
Oh yeah, that the fact that you are flawed does not mean that you cannot be a change maker.
Yeah.
In fact, every effective change maker who has ever existed was flawed in some way.
Right, because every person is flawed. And that part really stuck with me too, how throughout the course of the movie, neither character was too shallow or too righteous to be portrayed as without flaw. They easily could have gone too far with Elphaba's activism to show her to just always be right, because a lot of the times she just is. And it wasn't that she wasn't right about the inhumanity that was happening. It was just
her lack of restraint and her emotional reactiveness made it such that a lot of the time she caused more harm than actually helping with Nessa or the lion cub. And Glinda made people feel so comforted and safe that she didn't always actually spur them to ask any important questions.
The power of this movie, and the thing that I will take away from it, is the movie wasn't black and white, it was pink and green.
Oh, yeah, that's cute.
If that makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
It's not either or, it's this shade or that shade. Or not even this shade or that shade, it's this shade and that shade.
Yeah, pink goes good with green. Great. Well, have fun in Japan. Sam's going to Japan, you guys.
Yeah. And if you're listening to this 5 years from now, I went to Japan.
Maybe you went back to Japan.
Maybe I did. I'm excited. So this is going to probably be our last episode of 2025.
Yeah.
So this was our first year of podcasting.
Yeah.
And I'm really excited for next year. I think we have a lot more great ideas on what we want to talk about.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to the books, the movies,
And the weird things.
and the weird things, and maybe even having some other voices.
Definitely. Also, we welcome suggestions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, if there's a book, a movie, or a phenomenon or figure that you would like us to talk about, please tell us.
Yeah. And with that,
Because
you have changed me
For good.
for good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I've been changed.